Today's project is not going to end with a beautiful finished part, but there were some interesting things that I learned along the way, so I'm going to share this process and maybe save someone else from following the same line of thought to its not so good ending. So what I'm making is a car mirror cover. I've got the original here and I have created a mold from that. So the mold creation process was pretty much exactly the same as the carbon fiber sword, so I didn't record that process again. Basically, you need to add a flange, use clay to smooth out any transitions, and then add, of course, plenty of release agent. I used wax and PVA. Then add the black surface coat, layers of fiberglass and resin, make it nice and sturdy. And then pop out the original part. So the mold is ready to go. I also did some post-processing just to get rid of a few kind of not so smooth areas. Anything that I wasn't super happy with, I just polished out. I've added release agent to this, again, wax and PVA. I'm coating the inside now with some resin, getting ready to put in the carbon fiber. So I experimented here with just using a gloved hand to spread out the resin, because in past I've had some instances where I accidentally damaged the PVA with using different utensils to spread this. So this worked fine. Of course it's super messy, but it does provide a very safe way of applying the resin so you're not going to damage your release agent. I made sure just to get this all on the inside. Obviously you don't need to coat the flange. That's just an excess edge there for your fabric to overlap so you have something to trim. So for the carbon fiber, I pre-cut my pieces. I also pre-formed them somewhat in the mold before I added the release agent. So all I did was cut the piece about to size, place it in, and finagle the weave to get it into those kind of difficult areas. And once I liked how it was situated, I used some spray adhesive, just a light coating, to lock each of the layers in place inside of the mold, just so that it would be easy to place once I was adding the resin. So I'm going to do a couple of layers here. Of course, the first one that goes in is going to be the cosmetic layer, so that's the most important one there. And I'm just placing it in and making sure that it gets situated so there aren't any gaps where it wasn't pressed against the mold properly, and trying to make sure that the weave is kind of straight in the direction that I wanted it to go. The curves on this are gentle enough that it's not necessary to do it in multiple parts with this 2x2 twill weave. It will conform pretty well. There is some distortion in the tighter areas, but that's okay for these purposes. I'm not too worried about that. And the original part had this ledge here, which I kind of regret putting in the mold, but it's there, so you have to kind of press the carbon fiber as much as possible and hope that it comes out okay. Really, those tight ledges like that just don't tend to come out too well. That's one nice thing about making a mold from a part. What I could have done really was change this shape any way I wanted using the clay, and maybe I'll try that later on. This one I just wanted to experiment with trying to recreate the part before going on to creating like an original style part. I left a pretty good edge here because I didn't want to have the fibers coming unraveled by having it too close to my cosmetic edge. So there is some waste there, unfortunately. I'm wetting out this layer and I'm just using a card here, trying that to spread it into the weave. That works pretty well. Fewer air bubbles introduced that way. But using a card on the mold, that's how you can very easily damage your PVA coat. So that's not a tool I'd recommend for that portion, but this is fine. In the end though, it's kind of just easier to use your gloved hand. You can really get some tactile feedback that way as to whether the fabric is properly soaked through and making sure that it's pressed against the mold. So really my hands are just my favorite tools for this type of shape. But it is extremely messy to do it this way, and do make sure that you're wearing gloves if you're going to be playing around with the resin. So I wetted it just a little past the live edge and then trimmed each layer as I was sure that it was in place and I didn't need to work at it anymore. Some of these curved areas needed some relief cuts on the outside in the flange area to properly sit into the mold. Obviously you don't want to cut too far or you're going to get unraveling in the cosmetic portion, so just some careful cuts there will help it to fit in better. But that's why it's important to wait till after you already have it wetted out into the mold to make sure that you've taken up all the slack that you need before you start adding relief cuts. With the first layer nice and neat, I'm going to add in my second layer, which has also been preformed using the same method by putting it into the mold, setting it with some spray adhesive. And because the spray adhesive is just on the inside, even if it shows somewhat, it's not going to show through from the front. Just makes it super easy to set it into the mold this way. Less messing around when you're trying to make sure it gets into the mold before the resin starts to set. It's really just exactly the same process with the second layer. Get it all in place, add some resin, trim the edge, add relief cuts as needed. And this layer isn't even going to show, so it isn't super important which way the weave is going or if it's perfectly oriented or anything. The main thing is just to make sure that it's pressed all the way into the mold and that the weave has as little distortion as possible, just so you don't end up with gaps that you can see through from the front. I do save all of the scraps that are of any reasonable size. They come in handy for running tests on small things, say if I want to experiment with a new resin or something, and eventually I may use them for some kind of forged carbon project, something like that. I don't know. But I am definitely a hoarder of carbon fiber scraps among all the other scraps that I hang on to, knowing that someday they'll come in handy. These do have some spray adhesive on them, so they're kind of more of a pain to store. They start to stick to each other. So any that have resin on them, just from my gloves, or that are falling apart too much, or that have just too much spray adhesive, those I won't save. There's some very tight areas in this mold around where it goes to the narrowest point, so that's an area to watch closely and make sure that the carbon fiber is in fact pressed into the mold, not just bridging something. Once it's in place, then just add more resin, again working it down into that kind of weird indentation at the front that I wish I'd left out. As you can see, I had settled on the glove spreading method exclusively by this point for this part. It's just the easiest way. Nothing to catch on the weave and pull it out of place. Sometimes that happens with using a card or some sort of spreader. If you get a snagging edge, it can really damage your weave, but it does have its place. I'm just trying to make sure that the carbon fiber is saturated. I'm not trying to oversaturate. So I don't need a bunch of excess resin in there so much as just ensuring that all the fibers have been soaked through. This is going to go under vacuum, so any excess resin is going to be pressed out through the peel ply into the breather cloth. I'm going to use a porous peel ply for this. I've got this nylon peel ply that I really quite like because it does conform to these types of shapes so well. Because it's porous, it does let excess resin with any of those air bubbles, it does let that seep out when it's under vacuum. The downside is that it lets the resin out, so you're going to have a less resin-rich layup, which is great if weight is your concern, but I noticed that for cosmetic purposes, with less resin in there, it can tend to have more pinholes and whatnot, so it's a trade-off. I haven't found the perfect balance just yet, and I haven't tried doing this with resin infusion. It's an even more equipment-intensive process with a lot of disposable parts to it, so I'm just seeing what sort of results I can get doing it a hand laid up and then into the vacuum bag process, as opposed to doing a resin infusion, which is going to be giving you the best pinhole-free results, or something like a pre-preg, but I don't have an autoclave set up, so I haven't experimented with that at this time. So here's that nylon release. It's Teflon coated, I believe. Something like that. Oh no, it's silicone coated, I think. It's really nice though. Disposable, unfortunately, but it does a great job of getting into these difficult areas and letting air bubbles escape when it's under vacuum. You do have to add some relief cuts still. This is not a cosmetic side, so I'm not concerned about how it looks so much as just how it functions. And I don't want the breather cloth to end up getting bonded to the part, because that's a huge pain to sand off or pull off, however you want to get it out. So you need some sort of separation between the part and the breather cloth, even if it's in a mold. You don't want that backside to be all furry with breather cloth. That's just no good. Had to get somewhat aggressive with the relief cuts on this. It just wasn't wanting to sit into the narrow parts of the mold. But I got it in place eventually. And it will get pressed down under vacuum anyways, so those smaller bubbles aren't such a concern. I just want to make sure that there is enough give that the peel ply can sit down into the mold against the carbon once it's all pressurized down. Or vacuumed down, not pressurized. So this went into the vacuum bag overnight. Now we can pull off that peel ply and the breather fabric. Any excess resin has gone into the breather, so it's bonded pretty well to that peel ply, but it does release just fine from the part. So the inside, of course, isn't beautiful, but it doesn't need to be. It is really resin poor, because this particular porous breather cloth does let any excess resin escape. So you're going to get the lightest ratio, or the lightest part there. So you're going to have less resin to carbon. And I have my trusty release tools here. Got some popsicle sticks that I've just trimmed to a flat edge. I find that this works well and doesn't damage the mold or the part. It just will break before it causes damage. But it does give you a leverage point if you can just loosen up all the edges and start to insert it underneath. Takes somewhat of some working at it to get this to pop out, because it is slightly locked around those corners where the resin was extended just past the working edge, but it comes out no problem after a bit of working at it. And it looks pretty good. Of course, we've still got PVA on there, and we've got all this extra edge that needs to be trimmed off. So I'm going to make sure that that's fully cured before removing the PVA, and it's time to trim this up. And it's only 2 layers, so there is some flexibility still. So if you wanted to have a rigid part, then you just would need to add more layers. So even though I'm not in the shot on most of this, I am wearing my protective equipment. So when you see me cutting carbon fiber, just know I'm wearing at least a dust mask. And in this case, it was really windy and I was worried about flying parts also. So I've got my full respirator and face shield to protect lungs and eyes. So just make sure if you're working with carbon fiber, don't neglect that. So I'm just using the barrel sander on my Dremel to trim into this. I just find it easier than using the cutting wheel. The cutting wheels I have do work okay, but it just tends to kind of melt it a little bit more. And also I'm always more worried about those breaking. So I found that this method works just fine, just to get a rough trim. And then you can just use the same tool to get a closer trim by turning it sideways. So fewer tool changes there. I'm always a fan of that. You just have to be really careful because, you know, one good slip and you've just taken a chunk out of the part. So this is a time to just slow down, take it a bit at a time, be more conservative. Some of that extra fabric I had already just trimmed away with scissors. It didn't even have resin in it. And because this is such a thin part with only 2 layers, you can use scissors to get a rough cut, as long as you're using old scissors you don't care about. These edges are very sharp, so I'm not wearing work gloves because I just need the full dexterity, so I just have gloves to keep the carbon fiber out of my fingernails and off my skin. But of course these gloves are really fragile, so I just completely snagged the thumb off of the glove. Luckily no skin came with it. Because the flange is at a different angle to the cosmetic portion of the part, it does give you a pretty good cutting line. It's not perfect though. In some areas it's kind of hard to tell where the exact stop point is because the line was created also with clay, which I bridged any gaps with, so it to some extent blurs the line of where the part ends and the flange starts. So I ended up putting it back into, or putting the part into this molded piece to double check where the edge needs to end. Now, it is possible, because this is a copy of the part, it is possible just to turn the carbon fiber piece into the part and not use the original part in the final piece. However, in this case, that's just not necessary. I'm aiming to end up using this as a skin, but a skin that's temporary, as opposed to laminating it over the part permanently, you know, bonding it with that part. Because I don't want to be bonding something to a part when it's still experimental. And also, you know, if you add it on there and then you change your mind, you want to take it off or add a different weave later on, doing it this way gives you that flexibility. That is also why I made it only 2 layers thick in this case, because I'm going to use it as a skin, not as a standalone part. I would probably add another layer or 2 if I were using it as a standalone part. Once I got close to having it trimmed to size, I put the part back inside of it and just traced on here with Sharpie. Actually, that surface from the porous peel ply does allow a marker to show up on it decently. So I just traced my finished edge where it needs to end up onto the part itself. That made it somewhat easier. And there is some give, because obviously this was molded from the outside and then I've added thickness by putting in the carbon fiber, so it fits somewhat differently than it would directly into the mold. I have a bit less extra than I would have liked, especially in some areas it's quite tight and I need to be extremely careful to conserve as much usable material as possible in those areas. But it was close enough that I could make do. Ideally, I would have liked the finished edge to extend further so that I could customize the fit somewhat better. And it can be pretty nerve-wracking getting into the fine-tuning stage of getting this part fitted, so I did check back quite often to see how close I was getting to where the edge needed to be. The good news is, though, because this is a separate piece from the original and I have a mold, worst case, if I mess this one up, I can just make another one. I don't have to do all the mold making work all over again, and I haven't ruined my original part. So that is a definite positive side to putting in the extra effort to make a mold, not just skinning over the original part from the start. In the end, I placed the part back inside and just trimmed right next to it. Again, you have to be really careful doing this so you don't grind away part of your original part, but this was the best way to get the fit as perfect as possible. There is a lip on the part that extends under the mirror cover, or the rest of the mirror that's on the vehicle. So the carbon fiber portion ends before that, so I'm trimming it up to the lower edge. Now that lip on the top there, as I said, I wish I hadn't included it in the mold. I should have probably just sanded it away, and I may just do that yet. I ended up with some dry spots there on this casting, and so I filled that in with some extra epoxy. So I'm just sanding away the excess on here. That's what all the white is. That's just extra epoxy. There's no carbon fiber in that portion. I just built it up further than I needed so I would have something to sand flush. I'm not sure what the purpose of this is. I don't really like the look So for carbon fiber, I think this would have been better done just as a simple clean line from bottom to top. But as I said, I'm just first trying to recreate the part before changing the design. But these kinds of lips just don't transfer very well. The carbon fiber just does not want to press into that edge. It ends up getting some extra pooled resin with air bubbles or just being dry, so it's not the best type of design. Even with the vacuum pressure, it just doesn't want to press into such a sharp edge. With the main part of the grinding done, I cleaned up the edges with some finer grit sandpaper. I think this is maybe 400, might be 220, I'm not sure, I think it's 220. And I have it's just a piece of sandpaper that's spray adhesive, attached with spray adhesive to a paint stir stick. Now there's definitely specialized tools that I'd like to get for this eventually, but really that works just fine. The backing of the stir stick keeps it from kind of unevenly removing the material. It gives you that flat edge. So it's all trimmed now as well as possible. I've got to do more work on the top portion where that ledge got kind of messed up. I have to try to get that blended in now. And I'm going to be doing a coat of sealer on this to protect the epoxy from the sun, since this is a piece that would be outdoors. So I sanded the whole thing to give the sealer something to bite into for better adhesion. I think I just used 400 grit. And at this point, there certainly are some pinholes all over this, and it didn't look too bad here. So I didn't add more epoxy at this point, just did the light sanding and went on to the sealer. So I was thinking that would probably be a good enough finish for this part, at least for this time around, before I make any changes. When you have pinholes in there, of course you have to be really careful not to leave any sanding dust in those pinholes, because then that will just get bonded in with the sealer and it will look much worse than the pinholes did before you sanded. So I cleaned it out really well under running water with an old toothbrush to get into any pockets that might be in there, and then I also, right before spraying the sealer, cleaned it off with alcohol to remove any final residue or fingerprints. I'm using an automotive sealer for this, one that I've used many times before, and I'm actually using it on a car part this time. So my first plan was just to do several light coats like you're supposed to do, but as I was spraying it, I noticed that the pinholes were getting even more pronounced, it seemed like, because the sealer didn't want to run into those, so it was just not looking great. So I tried something that was, in hindsight, not the best idea. Ended up spraying it quite thick, and while it was still fluid before it cured, spreading it into the pinholes, and while I was doing it, it looked a lot better. So this is the deceptive part of sealers that I have fallen prey to before. Before it dries, it seems like it's filling things in pretty well and that you're going to get this thick glossy finish over top that maybe, just needs some sanding but can then be just sanded and polished to look really nice. The thing is though, when the sealer dries, it shrinks and it's no longer filling things in nearly as well as it looked while it was still wet. So this was mistake number one. I should have just done more surface prep before adding the sealer. For example, add more coats of epoxy and sand that, because the sealer is not going to make the finish better. If it's not perfect, it's not going to improve that. If anything, it just kind of makes it look worse. So mistake number one. Great. So once this dried, I went to the next step, which was sanding and polishing to get rid of the sort of brush strokes that were left behind from spreading the sealer into the pinholes. And it just wasn't looking good. It looked worse than before I started doing the sealer. And eventually I just decided that this would be a good opportunity to test something else that I have been curious about, which is, instead of adding the epoxy in coats and sanding like I did with the sword, what if I just add more epoxy on the outside and put it back into the mold to try to get that nice surface a second time around? So I sanded the whole thing to make sure that there was something for the epoxy to bite into after I'd been trying to polish this thing. And I added the release wax, the PVA again, all over again to the mold. Added some epoxy into the mold like I would if I were putting the carbon in, and also spread the epoxy over the surface, trying to make sure that all those pinholes were filled this time. Because the thing is, when you spread the epoxy on the part and don't put it in the mold, the epoxy just wants to run off everywhere. Because this laminating epoxy is pretty thin, it'd probably be better to use some sort of thicker epoxy, but this was what I had, so I just didn't want to do the same thing I'd done with the sword, which was filling and sanding and filling and sanding. So this was the method that I tried. It seemed like it could work. So I put the parts together and I added some release. I used just a porous plastic release film, and I added the breather cloth, thinking that excess resin theoretically should be able to escape out of the edges along with air bubbles and whatnot. However, this just does not work the same way as when it's a fabric with the epoxy going in. It ended up trapping the air between the part and the mold. So, and yes, some of the resin escaped, but it didn't go up through the release film into the peel ply. It more just spread down onto the inside of my part. It kind of distorted that shape to where I would need to sand away a decent amount of material to be able to fit it back over my original part like a skin, like I'd planned. And on top of that, it didn't even stay coated over the whole surface there. I ended up with some really bad, I mean, I would normally call them dry areas, but because the carbon underneath was already epoxy, they're just really uneven trapped air areas. Additionally, the entire surface is somewhat cloudy, and that could be something to do with the sealer that was underneath, maybe because that had only cured for like a day, that maybe it reacted with the epoxy, or it could just be that there was so much trapped air in there. I've got micro bubbles, who knows. But the cloudiness is sort of the least of my worries at this point. This is a horrible surface, far worse than I started with, so I'm glad that I tested this on something that didn't really matter, because I still have the mold. I can just cast another one of these parts after learning from these mistakes and not try this ever again with putting a part back into the mold like that. Seemed like it could possibly be a shortcut, but in the end, it wasn't. I'm very glad that I didn't attach this to the original part, because now I would be trying to sand off all of this mess from the original part too. So instead, I can just cast another skin, try again. Now, one option that could work would be to add a layer of carbon fiber into the mold and then just use the original cast part to press everything in, bond an additional layer on top. That might just work. I'm probably wouldn't try that though, because I don't think it's worth it at that point. The part's going to then be thicker, and there's a good chance that air could still get trapped in there, much worse than first time around casting, but sort of an interesting thought. I think overall in the end it's just better just to start over. My mold is still good to go, so as long as you don't skimp on the release agent application, then your worries are few.